The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of the downtown courthouse as Judge Robert Hayes pulled into his usual parking spot. It was 8:15 a.m. on a Monday and the building was already buzzing with activity. Lawyers hurried past with their briefcases. Court clerks chatted as they walked through the doors, and security guards took their positions for another busy day. Robert had been serving as a judge for 12 years, but today felt different somehow. Maybe it was because he'd stayed up late the night before reviewing a particularly complex case. Or maybe it was just Monday morning blues. Either way, he grabbed his coffee from the passenger seat and walked toward the employee entrance, the same route he'd taken hundreds of times before. What Robert didn't know was that today would test everything he believed about patience, understanding, and the power of first impressions. As he approached the side door marked "Authorized Personnel Only," Robert noticed a new face among the security staff. Officer Tommy Rodriguez had just started working at the courthouse 3 weeks ago. He was eager to prove himself and had been studying the security manual religiously. His supervisor had stressed the importance of following procedures exactly, especially during the busy morning hours when people tried to slip through security. Robert was dressed in his usual Monday attire, a well-tailored navy suit, crisp white shirt, and conservative tie. He looked professional, but without his judicial robes, he appeared to be just another lawyer or court employee. In his rush that morning, he'd forgotten to clip his judicial ID badge to his jacket, something that would prove to be more significant than he could have imagined. Tommy watched as this well-dressed man approached the employee entrance with confidence. Something about the situation triggered his training. The courthouse had been very clear about security protocols, especially after recent incidents at courthouses around the country. Everyone, regardless of how they looked or how confidently they walked, needed to show proper identification. "Excuse me, sir," Tommy called out, his voice polite but firm. "Are you authorized to use this entrance?" Robert paused, slightly surprised by the question. He'd been using this entrance for over a decade. "Yes, I work here," he replied with a friendly smile, expecting that would be enough. But Tommy had his orders. "I'll need to see your ID badge, please." That's when Robert reached for his jacket pocket and felt nothing. His heart sank slightly as he remembered rushing out that morning. His judicial ID was sitting on his desk in his chambers, right where he'd left it Friday afternoon after a long day of hearings. "I seem to have left my badge upstairs in my office," Robert explained, maintaining his calm demeanor. "I'm Judge Hayes. I work on the 3rd floor. Tommy studied the man's face. He seemed sincere enough, but the security training had been very specific. No ID meant using the public entrance and going through the metal detectors like everyone else. It didn't matter if someone claimed to be the governor himself. "I'm sorry, sir, but without proper identification, I'll need to ask you to use the main entrance and go through security screening," Tommy said, pointing toward the front of the building where a line of people was already forming. Robert felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He'd experienced moments like this before throughout his life, times when his appearance seemed to trigger extra scrutiny, but he'd learned long ago that staying calm and patient usually resolved these situations quickly. "I understand you're doing your job," Robert said, his voice steady and respectful, "but I really do work here. I'm expected in court in 45 minutes, and going through the public entrance will make me late for a very important hearing." By now, several people had started to notice the conversation. A few lawyers walking past glanced over, and Robert could see recognition in some of their faces. He'd presided over cases for many of them, but something held them back from immediately speaking up. Maybe they weren't sure if they should interfere, or maybe they wanted to see how the situation would play out. Tommy felt the weight of eyes on him. This was exactly the kind of situation his training had prepared him for, but actually dealing with it was more complicated than he'd expected. The man seemed genuine, spoke well, and clearly knew his way around the courthouse. But rules were rules, and Tommy had only been on the job for 3 weeks. "Sir, I really do need to follow protocol here," Tommy said, his voice showing a hint of uncertainty for the first time. "If you could just go around to the main entrance, I'm sure security can verify your identity quickly." Robert glanced at his watch. The line at the main entrance was getting longer, and he knew from experience that it could take 20 minutes or more to get through security during the morning rush. He had a pre-trial conference at 9 o'clock that couldn't be delayed. "Officer," Robert said, reading Tommy's name tag. "Officer Rodriguez, I completely understand your position," Security is important and I respect that you're trying to do your job properly, but I've been working in this building for 12 years. Surely there's someone around who can vouch for me? Tommy looked around nervously. He could see other courthouse employees watching the interaction, but none had stepped forward to help resolve the situation. Some seemed to recognize the man claiming to be a judge, but others appeared uncertain. Just then, a veteran court clerk named Betty walked by. She'd worked at the courthouse for 25 years and knew every judge, lawyer, and staff member by name. When she saw Robert standing outside the employee entrance, she did a double-take. "Judge Hayes?" she called out, clearly surprised to see him having any kind of difficulty entering the building. Tommy's eyes widened. So the man really was a judge. But his training kicked in again. Even judges needed to show proper identification. That's what made this situation so difficult. "Ma'am, do you know this gentleman?" Tommy asked Betty. "Know him? Of course I know him. That's Judge Robert Hayes. He's been here longer than most of us," Betty replied, looking confused about why there was even a question. Robert felt a mixture of relief and continued frustration. While Betty's recognition was helpful, he could see that Tommy was still struggling with what to do next. The young officer clearly wanted to follow the rules, but he was also beginning to realize he might have made an error in judgment. "I appreciate the confirmation," Tommy said to Betty, "but I still need to see proper identification. That's the policy for everyone." The situation was becoming more complex by the minute. Word was starting to spread through the courthouse that there was some kind of incident involving Judge Hayes at the employee entrance. People were beginning to gather, some out of curiosity, others out of genuine concern. Robert could feel the weight of the moment. How he handled this situation would be remembered by everyone watching. He could demand to speak to a supervisor, raise his voice, or use his authority as a judge to force his way through, but none of those options felt right to him. Instead, he took a deep breath and made a decision that would surprise everyone present, including himself. Robert looked at the growing crowd of onlookers and made his choice. "Officer Rodriguez, you're absolutely right to follow the rules. I'll go around to the main entrance." Tommy felt a wave of relief mixed with confusion. He'd expected the judge to pull rank or demand special treatment, but instead the man was actually supporting his decision to follow protocol. Still, something didn't feel right about making a judge go through regular security screening just because of a forgotten ID badge. "Sir, maybe we could call your chambers and have someone bring down your identification," Tommy suggested, trying to find a middle ground. "That's thoughtful of you, but my assistant doesn't arrive until 9, Robert replied. "And I can't ask the court clerk to leave her duties just to fetch my badge." As Robert started walking toward the front of the building, Tommy felt increasingly uncomfortable. Other courthouse employees were watching, and some were whispering among themselves. He caught fragments of conversations. "That's really Judge Hayes, and can you believe this is happening?" Meanwhile, at the main entrance, a long line had formed. Court was starting soon, and lawyers, witnesses, and family members were all waiting to get through security. The metal detectors beeped regularly, bags were being searched, and the whole process moved at a frustratingly slow pace. Robert took his place at the end of the line, checking his watch again. It was now 8:35, and his pre-trial conference was scheduled for 9. If everything went smoothly, he might just make it. But courthouse security was never predictable, especially on Monday mornings. Behind him in line, 2 lawyers were discussing their cases. One of them, David Chen, had appeared before Judge Hayes many times and held him in high regard. When David looked up and saw the judge standing in the security line like any other visitor, he was shocked. "Judge Hayes, what are you doing in this line?" David asked, genuinely confused. "Forgot my ID badge this morning," Robert explained with a wry smile. "Security is doing their job properly." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. "But surely someone could verify your identity." "You've been here for years." "They offered to, but I think it's important to follow the same rules as everyone else," Robert said. "Besides, it gives me a chance to see how our security procedures work from a different perspective." Word of the judge's situation continued to spread through the courthouse. In the administrative offices, Building Supervisor Helen Foster received a phone call from one of the security guards upstairs. "Ma'am, we have an unusual situation. Judge Hayes is going through public security because he forgot his ID badge this morning." Helen nearly dropped her coffee cup. "He's what? Why isn't he just going through the employee entrance?" The new guard, Rodriguez, stopped him and insisted he follow standard protocol. Helen felt her stomach drop. This was exactly the kind of situation that could turn into a major problem for the courthouse. Judges were appointed officials who deserved respect, but security protocols existed for good reasons. She needed to handle this carefully. Back in the security line, Robert was slowly making progress. The family in front of him was having trouble with the metal detector. The father had forgotten to remove his belt, and their bags needed additional screening. Each delay ate into Robert's remaining time. At 8:45, with still 6 people ahead of him in line, Robert began to wonder if he'd made the right choice. He could have insisted on speaking to a supervisor, could have used his authority to resolve the situation quickly. But something about Officer Rodriguez's earnest attempt to do his job properly had resonated with him. Tommy, meanwhile, was having second thoughts about his handling of the situation. He'd been watching the front entrance and could see Judge Hayes still waiting in line. Other courthouse employees who passed by the security checkpoint gave him questioning looks, and some seemed genuinely upset about what was happening. Maybe I should have bent the rules just this once, Tommy thought to himself. Everyone seems to know and respect this judge. But then he remembered his training supervisor's words. The moment you start making exceptions, you compromise security for everyone. Rules exist for a reason, and they only work if they apply to everyone equally. At 8:50, Robert finally reached the metal detector. The security guard operating the machine, Officer Patricia Williams, had worked at the courthouse for 8 years. When she saw Judge Hayes removing his watch and emptying his pockets like any other visitor, she was stunned. "Judge Hayes? Sir, what are you doing here?" Patricia asked quietly. "Going through security like everyone else," Robert replied with good humor. "Forgot my badge this morning." Patricia looked around nervously. She knew there were procedures for situations like this, but she'd never had to deal with a judge going through public security. "Sir, I could escort you upstairs right now. Everyone knows who you are." "I appreciate that, Patricia, but I'm already here. Let's just get this done properly." Robert stepped through the metal detector without incident. As he gathered his belongings on the other side, he noticed that several people in the courthouse lobby had stopped to watch. Some were court employees who recognized the unusual situation. Others were lawyers and visitors who sensed something significant was happening. By now it was 8:52, and Robert needed to move quickly to make his 9 appointment. As he headed toward the elevators, he encountered more surprised faces. Court clerks did double takes, bailiffs looked confused, and lawyers whispered to each other about seeing a judge come up from the public entrance. In the 3rd-floor hallway, Robert's judicial assistant, Linda Peterson, was preparing for the day ahead. She'd organized the files for the morning's pretrial conference and was reviewing the case notes. When she heard footsteps approaching at 8:58, she looked up expecting to see the judge coming from his usual route through the employee areas. "Judge Hayes, you're cutting it close this morning," Linda said with a smile. "The attorneys for the Wilson case are already waiting in conference room B." "It's been an interesting morning," Robert replied, heading toward his chambers to grab his robe and the forgotten ID badge. "I'll tell you about it later." As Robert quickly put on his judicial robe, he reflected on the past 45 minutes. Officer Rodriguez had been doing exactly what he was trained to do. The security procedures, while sometimes inconvenient, were designed to protect everyone in the courthouse. And yet the situation had raised questions that went beyond simple rule following. At exactly 9:00 a.m., Robert entered conference room B, where 2 attorneys were waiting with their clients for the pretrial discussion. Neither lawyer had any idea of the morning's events, and the meeting proceeded normally. But throughout the 30-minute conference, Robert found his mind drifting back to his encounter with Officer Rodriguez. After the meeting concluded, Robert made an unexpected decision. Instead of moving on with his day as usual, he asked Linda to call down to security and request that Officer Rodriguez come to his chambers when his shift allowed. "Is there a problem, Judge?" Linda asked, concerned. "No problem at all," Robert replied. "I just think Officer Rodriguez and I need to have a conversation." Meanwhile, Tommy was finishing his morning shift at the employee entrance, still troubled by the morning's events. He'd followed procedure exactly as trained, but the reactions of other courthouse employees had made him question whether he'd handled the situation correctly. When the call came that Judge Hayes wanted to see him, Tommy felt his heart sink. This was it. The conversation he'd been dreading since 8:15 that morning. He was probably going to lose his job over this incident. As Tommy rode the elevator to the third floor, he tried to prepare himself for the worst. He'd only been working at the courthouse for 3 weeks, and now he'd managed to embarrass a judge on a Monday morning. His career in courthouse security was probably over before it had really begun. But what Tommy didn't know was that Judge Hayes had something very different in mind for their upcoming conversation. Something that would surprise not just Tommy, but everyone who would eventually hear about what happened next. Tommy knocked softly on the door to Judge Hayes's chambers, his hands slightly trembling. Through the frosted glass, he could see the silhouette of the judge sitting at his desk. This was the moment he'd been dreading since his supervisor had called to say the judge wanted to see him. "Come in," came the calm voice from inside. Tommy opened the door and stepped into the spacious office. The walls were lined with law books, diplomas, and awards. Behind the large oak desk sat Judge Hayes, no longer in his suit from that morning, but wearing the black judicial robe that commanded respect throughout the courthouse. "Officer Rodriguez, please have a seat," Judge Hayes said, gesturing to one of the chairs facing his desk. Tommy sat down, his back straight, prepared for what he assumed would be a reprimand or worse. "Sir, I want to apologize for this morning. I was just trying to follow the security protocols, but I realize I may have handled the situation inappropriately." Judge Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying the young officer's face. Tommy looked genuinely remorseful, but also confused about what he might have done wrong. "Tell me, Officer Rodriguez, how long have you been working in security?" the judge asked. 3 weeks, sir. This is my first job in courthouse security, though I worked in building security before this." "And what does your training manual say about identification requirements?" Tommy straightened up slightly. "It says that all personnel entering through employee entrances must display proper identification badges. No exceptions, regardless of position or how long they've worked in the building." "And what did you do this morning when I couldn't produce my ID?" "I asked you to use the public entrance and go through standard security screening, sir." Judge Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "So you followed your training exactly?" Tommy was confused now. The judge didn't sound angry. If anything, he sounded almost approving. "Yes, sir, but everyone seems to think I made a mistake." "What kind of mistake do you think you made?" "Well," Tommy hesitated, "maybe I should have recognized you, or asked around to verify your identity, or called a supervisor right away." Judge Hayes stood up and walked to the window overlooking the courthouse steps where people were still coming and going. "Officer Rodriguez, let me ask you something. If someone who looked different than me had approached that door without identification, what would you have done?" Tommy thought for a moment. "The same thing, sir. I would have asked them to use the public entrance." "Exactly." Judge Hayes turned back to face Tommy. "And that's precisely why what you did this morning wasn't a mistake at all." Tommy's confusion deepened. "I don't understand, sir." Judge Hayes walked back to his desk but remained standing. "Officer Rodriguez, do you know why security protocols exist? To protect everyone in the building and ensure that only authorized personnel have access to restricted areas." "That's right. And those protocols only work if they're applied consistently to everyone. The moment security guards start making exceptions based on who they think deserves special treatment, the entire system breaks down." Tommy was beginning to see where this conversation was heading, but he still wasn't sure if he was in trouble or not. "Sir, but you are a judge. Surely that should count for something." Judge Hayes smiled for the first time during their conversation. "It does count for something. It means I should set an example by following the same rules as everyone else, especially when I make a mistake like forgetting my ID badge." "But all those people watching seemed upset with me," Tommy said. "They were surprised, and maybe some were uncomfortable with the situation. But that doesn't mean you did anything wrong." Judge Hayes sat back down. "Let me tell you something about leadership. Officer Rodriguez, true leadership isn't about demanding special treatment. It's about showing others how to do the right thing, even when it's inconvenient." Tommy felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "So you're not upset with me?" "Upset? Not at all. In fact, I'm impressed." Judge Hayes picked up a pen from his desk and turned it over in his hands. "In 3 weeks on the job, you've already shown more integrity than some people develop in years. You had pressure from other employees. You had someone claiming to be a judge, and you had a crowd of people watching. But you stuck to your principles and did what you thought was right. It didn't feel right, though, Tommy admitted. I felt terrible making you go through public security. Why did it feel wrong? Tommy thought carefully before answering. I guess because everyone expected me to treat you differently. Like I was being disrespectful somehow, Judge Hayes nodded. And that's exactly the kind of thinking that can compromise security. The moment guards start deciding who deserves special treatment based on appearance, position, or pressure from bystanders, the system becomes unreliable. But what if there had been a real emergency? What if you'd missed an important hearing because of my decision? Then that would have been the consequence of my mistake, not yours. I'm the one who forgot my ID. You were just doing your job. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly. Officer Rodriguez, let me ask you something else. This morning, when you first saw me approaching the employee entrance, what was your very first thought? Tommy shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This felt like a test, and he wasn't sure how honest he should be. It's okay, Judge Hayes encouraged. I want your honest answer. I thought you looked professional and confident, like you belonged there. But then my training kicked in, and I remembered that everyone needs to show ID, no matter how they look or act. Good. That's exactly the right thought process. Judge Hayes set down his pen. Now, what if I told you that throughout my career, I've been in situations where my appearance led to assumptions about whether I belonged in certain places? Tommy wasn't sure how to respond to that. What I'm saying is that your training to treat everyone equally, regardless of appearance or perceived status, is more important than you might realize. It protects everyone, not just the building, but the principle of equal treatment under the law. The judge's words were starting to sink in. Tommy had been worried that he'd made a terrible mistake, but Judge Hayes was suggesting that following the rules consistently was actually the right thing to do. Sir, can I ask you something? Tommy said. Of course. Why are you taking the time to explain all this to me? Most people in your position would probably just want me written up or transferred somewhere else. Judge Hayes was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window again. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of experience that Tommy was just beginning to understand. Because, Officer Rodriguez, moments like this morning define who we are and what we stand for. You had a choice to make under pressure, and you chose to uphold the principles you were taught rather than cave to social pressure or assumptions about status. That kind of integrity is rare, and it's worth recognizing. Tommy felt a warmth spreading through his chest that he hadn't expected when he'd knocked on the judge's door. What happens now? Tommy asked. Judge Hayes smiled again. Now we make sure that what happened this morning becomes a learning opportunity for everyone in this courthouse, starting with us. But Tommy had no idea just how far-reaching that learning opportunity would become. Judge Hayes walked over to a small sitting area in his chambers where two comfortable chairs faced each other across a low table. Officer Rodriguez, would you mind joining me over here? I'd like to continue our conversation in a less formal setting. Tommy moved to the sitting area, still processing everything the judge had told him. This wasn't at all how he'd expected this meeting to go. I want to share something with you, Judge Hayes began, settling into his chair. When I was 25 years old, fresh out of law school, I had my first job interview at a prestigious law firm downtown. I wore my best suit, arrived 15 minutes early, and walked confidently into the building. Tommy leaned forward, sensing that this story was important. When I approached the reception desk, the security guard looked at me and said, "Deliveries go around to the back entrance." I explained that I was there for an interview, and he looked skeptical. He made me wait while he called upstairs to verify my appointment, even though I had the confirmation letter in my hand. How did that make you feel? Tommy asked. Frustrated, embarrassed, angry, Judge Hayes replied honestly. I had every credential needed for that position, but this guard made an assumption based on how I looked and decided I didn't belong in the front lobby of that law firm. Tommy nodded, beginning to understand why the judge had been so patient during their morning encounter. But here's what I learned from that experience, Judge Hayes continued. The guard wasn't necessarily trying to be discriminatory. He was following what he thought were the building's policies and procedures. The real problem was that those procedures weren't applied consistently to everyone. What do you mean? I watched that lobby for 20 minutes while I waited for my interview. I saw other people walk in without being questioned, without having to provide verification, without being redirected to different entrances. The procedures seemed to change depending on who was walking through the door. Tommy was quiet, thinking about the implications of what Judge Hayes was describing. After I got the job at that firm, Judge Hayes continued, I made it a point to learn everyone's name, from the senior partners down to the security staff and cleaning crew, and I noticed something interesting about that security guard who had questioned me on my first day. What was that? His name was Frank, and he'd been working there for 30 years. Frank was a good man who took his job seriously, but he'd never received any training about unconscious bias or consistent application of procedures. He was making split-second decisions about who looked like they belonged and who didn't, without even realizing he was doing it. Tommy shifted in his chair. What happened with Frank? Frank and I became friends, actually. I started stopping by his desk every morning to say hello. We'd talk about sports, his grandchildren, my law cases. Over time, I noticed that he began treating all visitors more consistently. Not because anyone told him to, but because our friendship had opened his eyes to the fact that appearances can be deceiving. Judge Hayes paused, letting the story sink in. The point is, Tommy, may I call you Tommy? Yes, sir. The point is, Tommy, that what you did this morning was actually a perfect example of how security should work. You applied the same standard to everyone, regardless of who they claimed to be or how they looked. Tommy felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized was there. But I still felt terrible about it. Feeling conflicted about difficult decisions is often a sign that you're thinking critically about your actions. That's a good thing. Judge Hayes leaned back in his chair. Let me ask you this. Have you noticed any inconsistencies in how security procedures are applied here at the courthouse? Tommy hesitated. This felt like dangerous territory. He didn't want to criticize his colleagues or supervisors. It's okay, Judge Hayes encouraged. I'm not asking you to get anyone in trouble. I'm genuinely curious about your observations as someone new to the system. Well, Tommy began carefully. I have noticed that some of the veteran guards seem to know everyone and wave them through without checking IDs. And sometimes people in expensive suits get different treatment than people who look like they might be family members or witnesses. Judge Hayes nodded. Those are exactly the kinds of inconsistencies that can undermine the effectiveness and fairness of security procedures. But isn't it normal for guards to get to know the regular employees and trust them? To some extent, yes. But there's a difference between building relationships and abandoning procedures entirely. Even people we know and trust should be willing to show their identification when asked. Tommy was beginning to see the bigger picture. So when you went through public security this morning, you were actually demonstrating that the rules should apply equally to everyone? Exactly. And your insistence that I follow those rules, even when other people were pressuring you to make an exception, showed real integrity. Tommy felt a sense of pride that he hadn't experienced since starting this job. For the first time in 3 weeks, he felt like he might actually be good at this work. Judge Hayes, can I ask you something personal? Sure. This morning when I stopped you at the door, did you think I was being discriminatory? Judge Hayes considered the question carefully. Honestly, for a split second I wondered if that might be part of it. But then I watched how you handled the situation, listened to your explanations, and saw that you were genuinely trying to follow the procedures you'd been taught. That told me everything I needed to know about your character. What do you mean? I mean that discrimination usually comes with disrespect, impatience, or hostility. You showed none of those things. You were polite, professional, and willing to work with me to find a solution. You offered to help me contact my office, suggested alternatives, and treated me with dignity throughout the entire interaction. Tommy felt a flood of relief. I was so worried that everyone would think I was targeting you specifically. Some people might think that, and unfortunately, that's a reality we have to deal with. But anyone who actually witnessed your behavior this morning would have seen a security officer doing his job professionally and consistently. Judge Hayes stood up and walked to his bookshelf, pulling out a thin manual. Tommy, I want to propose something to you, and I want you to feel free to say no if you're not interested. What is it, sir? I think what happened this morning could be the beginning of something positive for this entire courthouse. Not just the security department, but everyone who works here. Judge Hayes held up the manual. This is a guide for developing inclusive workplace policies. I'm wondering if you'd be interested in working with me to review our current security procedures and see if we can make them more consistent and fair for everyone. Tommy's eyes widened. You want me to help review security policies? You're the newest member of the security team, which means you see our procedures with fresh eyes. You've already shown that you're willing to apply rules consistently, even under pressure. And your questions about how different people are treated show that you're thinking critically about these issues." Tommy was stunned. He'd come to this meeting expecting to be reprimanded or fired, and instead the judge was asking for his help in improving the courthouse. "I don't know if I'm qualified for something like that," Tommy said honestly. "Qualification isn't just about experience or education," Judge Hayes replied. "Sometimes it's about having the right mindset and the willingness to do what's right, even when it's difficult. You demonstrated both of those things this morning." Tommy sat quietly for a moment, processing the magnitude of what Judge Hayes was proposing. "If I agreed to help with this, what would it involve?" "We'd start by documenting current procedures and observing how they're actually implemented. Then we'd identify areas where consistency could be improved. Finally, we'd develop training materials to help all security staff understand not just what the rules are, but why consistent application matters." The scope of the project was both exciting and intimidating to Tommy, but something about Judge Hayes' approach made him feel like this could be an opportunity to make a real difference. "Judge Hayes, why are you willing to invest this much time and energy in something that started with me stopping you at a door?" Judge Hayes smiled and returned to his chair. "Because, Tommy, leadership isn't about avoiding problems or pretending they don't exist. It's about recognizing opportunities to make things better, even when those opportunities come from unexpected situations." Tommy looked out the window at the courthouse steps where people continued to come and go, each with their own stories and reasons for being there. "I'd like to help," he said finally. "I'm not sure I'll be very good at it, but I'd like to try." Judge Hayes extended his hand for a shake. "I have a feeling you're going to be better at this than you think." As they shook hands, neither man could have predicted just how much impact their partnership would have on everyone who worked in or visited the courthouse in the months to come. 6 months after that memorable Monday morning, Tommy Rodriguez stood in the courthouse's main conference room, facing an audience of security personnel, court staff, and administrators from courthouses across 3 counties. What had started as a simple case of forgotten identification had grown into something nobody could have anticipated. "Good morning, everyone," Tommy began, his voice steady and confident in a way that would have surprised his earlier self. "6 months ago, I was a new security officer who made what some people thought was a big mistake. Today I want to tell you why that mistake became the foundation for transforming how we think about security and respect in our courthouse." Judge Hayes sat in the front row, smiling as he watched Tommy address the crowd. The transformation in the young officer had been remarkable, but it was just one part of a much larger change that had swept through their courthouse. "Let me start by telling you about the morning everything changed," Tommy continued. "It was my 3rd week on the job, and I stopped someone at the employee entrance who didn't have his ID badge. That person happened to be Judge Hayes, and what he did next taught me more about leadership and integrity than any training manual ever could." In the audience, several people who had witnessed that original incident nodded, remembering how uncomfortable the situation had seemed at the time. Tommy clicked to the first slide of his presentation. Judge Hayes could have pulled rank, demanded special treatment, or had me written up for doing my job. Instead, he went through public security like anyone else, then invited me to his chambers for a conversation that changed my entire perspective on what it means to serve others. The slide showed the courthouse's old security procedures, inconsistent and often applied based on familiarity rather than established protocols. What we discovered in our review was that security wasn't just about keeping bad people out, Tommy explained. It was about creating an environment where everyone, employees, visitors, attorneys, families, witnesses, felt they were being treated with equal dignity and respect. Judge Hayes watched as Tommy moved through the presentation with confidence and clarity. Over the past 6 months, Tommy had interviewed dozens of courthouse employees, observed security procedures at different times of day, and worked with administrators to develop new training protocols. The changes we implemented weren't complicated, Tommy continued, but they required everyone to shift their thinking. Instead of having different rules for different people, we created consistent procedures that apply to everyone equally. He clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from the past 6 months. Since implementing our new procedures, we've had 0 security incidents, but more importantly, our visitor satisfaction surveys show a 40% improvement in how people feel they're treated when entering the courthouse. Betty, The veteran court clerk who had witnessed the original incident raised her hand. Tommy, how did you handle resistance from staff who were used to the old way of doing things? Tommy smiled. That's a great question, Betty, and you probably remember that morning better than anyone. The audience chuckled softly. The key was helping everyone understand that consistency isn't about being inflexible or unfriendly. It's about ensuring that everyone gets the same level of professional treatment. He clicked to a slide showing photos of the security team. Judge Hayes helped me understand that when we make exceptions based on who we think deserves special treatment, we're actually undermining the very system we're trying to protect. From the back of the room, Helen Foster, the building supervisor, spoke up. What's been the most significant change you've observed? Tommy paused thoughtfully. The most significant change has been in how our staff interact with visitors who might be nervous, confused, or unfamiliar with courthouse procedures. Instead of rushing people through or making assumptions about why they're here, we take time to explain what's happening and make sure they feel welcomed. Judge Hayes stood up. If I may add something to Tommy's excellent presentation, he said, and the room fell quiet with attention. What Tommy is too modest to mention is that his approach to security has influenced how we handle other aspects of courthouse operations as well. He walked to the front of the room. Tommy's observation that consistency and respect go hand in hand has changed how we train new employees, how we interact with attorneys and their clients, and how we think about accessibility for people with disabilities or language barriers. Tommy nodded appreciatively. The partnership with Judge Hayes had opened doors he never could have imagined when he first started working at the courthouse. We've also discovered, Judge Hayes continued, that when staff feel supported in doing their jobs correctly, rather than pressured to make exceptions or take shortcuts, they perform better and feel more confident in their roles. A security supervisor from another courthouse raised her hand. How do you handle situations where people really do need special accommodations? Tommy fielded this question. Great point. We've learned to distinguish between equal treatment and identical treatment. Everyone goes through the same security process, but we've improved our procedures for people who need assistance, have medical devices, or face other challenges. The key is that these accommodations are available to anyone who needs them, not just people who look a certain way or claim a certain status. After the presentation ended, people lingered to ask questions and discuss implementation strategies. Tommy found himself surrounded by security officers from other courthouses who wanted to understand how to adapt these approaches to their own buildings. Later that afternoon, as Tommy was finishing his shift, Judge Hayes stopped by the security desk. Outstanding presentation today. Tommy, I'm proud of the work you've done. Thank you, sir. I never imagined that morning 6 months ago would lead to all this. Judge Hayes smiled. Leadership has a way of emerging in unexpected moments. What you did that Monday morning, sticking to your principles under pressure, showed the kind of character that can't be taught in a classroom. I've been thinking about that morning a lot lately, Tommy said. If you had reacted differently, if you had been angry or demanded that I bend the rules, everything would have gone in a completely different direction. That's true. But you can't control how other people react. You can only control your own actions and decisions. That morning you chose integrity over convenience, and that choice created the foundation for everything that followed. Tommy looked around the courthouse lobby, watching the steady flow of people coming and going. Security staff greeted visitors professionally, explained procedures clearly, and treated everyone with the same level of respect and attention. Judge Hayes, can I ask you something I've been wondering about? Of course. Do you think that morning really was just about a forgotten ID badge, or was there something bigger at work? Judge Hayes considered the question carefully. I think that morning was about two people making choices under pressure. You chose to do your job with integrity, and I chose to respond with patience and curiosity instead of anger. Those choices created an opportunity for something positive to happen, and now other courthouses are implementing similar programs. Yes, and that's the incredible part. What started as a simple interaction between two people has influenced how thousands of courthouse employees and visitors are treated every day. As Judge Hayes prepared to leave for the day, he turned back to Tommy. You know what the most remarkable thing about all this is? What's that? 6 months ago, you were worried that you'd made a career-ending mistake. Today, you're training security supervisors from across the region on best practices. That transformation didn't happen because of your position or your credentials. It happened because you were willing to do the right thing, even when it was uncomfortable. Tommy smiled. I guess sometimes what looks like a mistake in the moment can turn out to be exactly what was needed. That's a lesson worth remembering, Judge Hayes replied. Both in courthouse security and in life. As Judge Hayes walked toward the exit, using his properly displayed ID badge to access the employee entrance, Tommy watched him go with a sense of gratitude that still felt fresh even after 6 months. The incident that had started with a simple, "Excuse me, sir, I need to see your identification," had become a story that courthouse employees shared with new hires, that administrators discussed in training seminars, and that both men would remember as a defining moment in their careers. But more than anything else, it had become proof that incredible transformations could begin with ordinary people, making extraordinary choices to treat others with dignity, respect, and fairness even when nobody was watching, even when it was difficult, and even when they weren't sure anyone would understand. The courthouse had become not just a safer place, but a more welcoming one, and it all started because one security officer chose to follow the rules consistently, and one judge chose to respond with grace instead of anger. Sometimes the most incredible stories begin with the simplest moments of human decency.